Stephen Colbert systematically dismantled the carefully constructed myth surrounding Donald Trump's time at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School by placing the candidate's own repeated public boasts side by side with the documentary record that has survived decades of scrutiny and deliberate attempts at concealment. Beginning with the familiar rally refrains in which Trump declared that he attended the Wharton School of Finance, that he was a very fine student, that he finished first in his class, that he was a super genius, and that Wharton was the hardest school in the country to get into, lines delivered with the same cadence and emphasis across multiple campaign cycles, as if sheer repetition could convert assertion into established fact. Yet the available academic records reveal no dean's list appearances, no graduation honors, no academic prizes, and no institutional recognition of exceptional performance, while contemporary enrollment data show that the acceptance rate at the undergraduate level during the mid-1960s, when Trump transferred from Fordham University, was substantially higher than the single-digit selectivity that later generations associate with Wharton, meaning the barrier to entry was far less formidable than the mythology later claimed, a discrepancy Colbert underscored by noting that millions of students have attended elite universities without ever inventing a narrative of unmatched intellectual supremacy, and that the problem was never mere attendance but the escalation of ordinary enrollment into a cornerstone of personal genius mythology, an escalation that invited closer inspection the moment Trump began attacking the intelligence of political opponents and demanding the release of their academic records, thereby reopening the very questions he had spent years trying to keep closed. Questions that ultimately circled back to the absence of supporting paperwork for his own elevated claims. And Colbert repeatedly returned to the rhetorical force of that absence, asking audiences to consider why a man who spoke so freely about his academic brilliance would simultaneously treat the underlying documents as state secrets. Why the same individual who insisted on transparency from others would order subordinates to threaten institutions into silence, and why the myth required constant reinforcement through public repetition if the underlying reality were as impressive as advertised, all of which led Colbert to observe that the damage was never primarily about grade point averages or class rank, but about the credibility gap that opens when a foundational story collapses under the weight of its own contradictions, a gap that then invites re-examination of every subsequent narrative built upon the same foundation of absolute self-assurance, from the self-made billionaire legend to the portrayal of business acumen so profound that ordinary rules of accounting and bankruptcy simply did not apply. And in that sense, the Wharton episode functioned as an origin story for a lifelong pattern of confidence, untethered from verifiable achievement, a pattern Colbert illustrated by replaying the rally clips in succession, so that the sameness of the language became impossible to ignore, the same phrases, recycled year after year, as if the passage of time and the accumulation of contradictory evidence could be overcome by volume alone. And the audience laughter that greeted each successive clip was not merely partisan schadenfreude, but recognition of a rhetorical strategy that had long since outlived its factual usefulness. A strategy that treated institutional prestige as personal property and treated any request for documentation as an act of aggression rather than ordinary verification. And Colbert pressed the point further by noting that ordinary students who graduate without honors do not spend decades insisting they finished first, that ordinary alumni do not require legal threats to keep their transcripts private, and that the intensity of the defensive apparatus surrounding Trump's academic record itself became evidence that the record would not support the mythology constructed around it, thereby transforming what might have been a minor biographical detail into a symbolic fracture in the larger image of unassailable competence, a fracture that Colbert suggested would continue to widen as long as the original claims remained unamended and the supporting documents remained locked away, leaving the public with the spectacle of a man who demanded the academic records of others while treating his own as radioactive material, a spectacle whose hypocrisy became self-evident once the two behaviors were placed in the same frame. And the longer Colbert dwelt on the mismatch between boast and documentation, the more clearly the segment revealed that the real subject was never undergraduate performance, but the architecture of self-mythologizing itself, an architecture that required the continuous assertion of genius, even in the face of institutional silence and professorial recollection to the contrary, and that once audiences began to notice the gap between the repeated claims and the available evidence, they were inevitably led to ask how many other foundational stories rested on similarly thin foundations, a question that Colbert allowed to hang in the air without forcing an answer. Trusting the cumulative weight of the documentary and testimonial contradictions to do the work of persuasion, And in that restrained approach, the segment achieved a clarity that pure partisan attack could never have matched, because the material itself, the absence of honors, the elevated acceptance rates of the era, the repetitive public language, the defensive legal maneuvers, carried its own internal logic once assembled in sequence, a logic that made the myth of Wharton genius appear less like a biographical fact and more like a necessary fiction whose exposure threatened the larger edifice of invulnerability that had been built around it over half a century of public performance. The most consequential testimony in Stephen Colbert's examination of the Wharton myth came not from partisan operatives or contemporary political rivals, but from Professor William T. Kelly, a longtime faculty member who taught thousands of students across a 31-year career and who, when asked about Donald Trump, consistently described him as the dumbest student he had ever encountered, a judgment rendered not in the heat of a presidential campaign but in the 1970s, and reiterated across subsequent decades with the same unadorned directness, a consistency that stripped the assessment of easy partisan dismissal and forced listeners to confront the possibility that the impression left by the young Trump had been extreme enough to remain vivid after 3 decades of subsequent teaching. And Kelly's characterization went beyond simple academic underperformance to describe a specific psychological posture, a student who entered the classroom already convinced of his own brilliance, who treated correction as an affront rather than an opportunity, who ignored concepts that challenged his pre-existing worldview, and who responded to questioning by deflection or subject changing rather than engagement, a set of habits that Colbert noted mapped with almost eerie precision onto the public behavior that audiences had observed for years in interviews, debates, and press conferences, thereby transforming a decades-old professorial recollection into a diagnostic lens for a lifelong pattern, and the force of Kelly's judgment was amplified by the sheer volume of students he had taught, making the singling out of one individual as uniquely resistant to learning a statement of comparative extremity rather than casual insult, a point Colbert underscored by reminding viewers that professors who encounter thousands of undergraduates rarely retain such sharp negative memories unless the underlying behavior was both persistent and memorable. And the segment then layered onto this academic testimony the sworn statements of Michael Cohen, Trump's former personal attorney, who testified that he had been ordered to contact schools and the College Board with threats aimed at preventing the release of grades or SAT scores, an instruction that Colbert framed as the logical extension of the same defensive posture Kelly had observed in the classroom, the refusal to allow external evaluation to disturb an internal narrative of superiority. And Colbert pressed the implications by asking why a man who claimed academic excellence would require legal intimidation to keep the supporting documents sealed, why decades-old transcripts would still be treated as dangerous material long after any ordinary professional embarrassment would have faded, and why the same individual who publicly demanded the academic records of Barack Obama and questioned the intelligence of political opponents would simultaneously construct a protective wall around his own educational history, a wall whose very existence invited the inference that the contents would not sustain the public mythology, and the juxtaposition of Kelly's professional judgment with Cohen's account of active concealment created a narrative arc that began in the classroom of the 1960s and ended in the campaign tactics of the 21st century. An arc that demonstrated continuity rather than rupture, and Colbert refused to let the audience treat the 2 episodes as isolated curiosities, instead presenting them as successive manifestations of the same underlying dynamic, the elevation of personal confidence above external evidence, and the conversion of any challenge to that confidence into an existential threat requiring aggressive response, a dynamic whose academic origins Kelly had identified with clinical precision, and whose later political expression Cohen had documented under oath. And the cumulative effect was to strip the Wharton story of its remaining protective ambiguity, leaving only the stark contrast between the repeated public boasts of genius and the combined testimony of a professor who remembered an unteachable student and a lawyer who had been instructed to keep the records buried, a contrast that Colbert allowed to speak for itself through careful sequencing rather than through escalating rhetoric, trusting that the professional distance of Kelly's decades-old assessment and the legal formality of Cohen's testimony would carry more persuasive weight than any amount of contemporary partisan commentary. And in that restraint, the segment achieved a rare clarity about the relationship between private academic history and public self-presentation, a clarity that made the subsequent discussion of credibility feel earned rather than imposed. because the evidence had already established that the gap between claim and documentation was not a matter of incomplete archives, but of deliberate, sustained effort to prevent the archives from being examined at all. Stephen Colbert closed the examination by tracing the classroom habits described by Professor Kelly into the public career that followed, showing how the same absolute confidence paired with aggressive deflection, the same refusal to absorb correction, the same compulsion to appear dominant even while wrong, and the same inability to utter the words "I don't know" reappeared across business negotiations, televised interviews, presidential debates, and campaign rallies, creating a continuous psychological signature that rendered the Wharton episode less an isolated biographical footnote and more the origin point of a lifelong pattern. And Colbert illustrated the continuity by intercutting the rally boasts about finishing first at the hardest school with later moments of public contradiction, rambling answers, and subject changing under pressure, allowing the formal resemblance between the student Kelly remembered and the public figure audiences had watched for years to become self-evident. And the audience response of knowing laughter reflected recognition, rather than mere partisanship. A recognition that the defensive architecture built around the academic record was continuous with the defensive architecture built around every subsequent claim of exceptional competence. And Colbert emphasized that the real damage was never about undergraduate grades, but about the credibility erosion that follows when a foundational myth is shown to rest on exaggeration and concealment. Because once audiences catch a public figure inflating one major credential, they begin to re-examine every other pillar of the self-constructed image. The self-made billionaire narrative that downplays inherited wealth, the business success story that glosses over multiple bankruptcies, the branding empire that often outran the underlying assets, and the constant insistence on intellectual superiority that brooks no acknowledgement of uncertainty, all of which suddenly appear less like independent achievements and more like successive layers of the same compensatory mythology. And Wharton therefore functioned as a symbolic cornerstone, whose fracture invited structural scrutiny of the entire edifice, a scrutiny that Colbert suggested was inevitable once the gap between repeated claim and available evidence became too wide to ignore, and the segment returned repeatedly to the counterfactual that if Trump had simply stated that he attended Wharton and left the matter there, almost no one would have cared. Because ordinary attendance at an elite school carries no special stigma and requires no defensive apparatus. But the decision to escalate attendance into a claim of unmatched genius and first-in-class status raised the stakes so high that the eventual collision with the documentary and testimonial record produced a collapse whose force was proportional to the height of the original exaggeration. And Colbert noted that this pattern of escalation followed by defensive overreaction had repeated itself across domains, each time converting what might have been manageable imperfections into crises of credibility by the refusal to admit limitation or uncertainty, and the refusal itself became the most consistent behavioral through-line, visible in the classroom according to Kelly, visible in the legal instructions according to Cohen, and visible in the public performances that Colbert replayed for the audience, a through-line that suggested the core issue was never raw intelligence, but the ego structure that treated any challenge to self-perception as intolerable, and that structure's political consequences were left for the audience to extrapolate, because the segment's purpose was not to litigate contemporary policy, but to demonstrate that the habits of mind visible in the 1960s had never been revised, only amplified by power and platform, and the final force of the piece rested on that demonstration of continuity, the recognition that the student who could not learn from correction became the public figure who could not concede error, and that the academic myth that required threats to protect became the political myth that required constant repetition to sustain, leaving viewers with the clear implication that perception had been allowed to overpower reality for as long as the paperwork remained sealed and the professorial testimony remained unamplified. But that once both were placed in the open, the myth looked different, not because the grades themselves mattered in isolation, but because the willingness to invent and defend an unearned superiority revealed a deeper relationship to truth that audiences were now free to evaluate on their own terms. Stephen Colbert's extended treatment of the Wharton episode ultimately transcended the narrow question of undergraduate transcripts and became an examination of how a single inflated claim, once protected by threats and sustained by repetition, can anchor an entire public identity, whose subsequent contradictions then appear less like isolated errors and more like structural necessities of the original fiction. A point the segment drove home by returning again and again to the simple observation that ordinary attendance at an elite school requires no mythology, no legal intimidation of registrars, and no lifelong insistence on having finished first, whereas the decision to convert that attendance into proof of unmatched genius created a permanent vulnerability that every subsequent challenge to competence would reopen. And Colbert illustrated the permanence of that vulnerability by showing how the same defensive posture Kelly had observed in the classroom, the refusal to absorb correction, the deflection under pressure, the compulsion to reassert dominance, even when the underlying claim was collapsing, reappeared with almost mechanical regularity whenever Trump's intelligence or preparation was questioned in later decades, whether in business negotiations where complex details were brushed aside with declarations of superior instinct, in televised interviews where factual corrections were met with subject changes or personal attacks, or in presidential debates where the absence of specific knowledge was papered over with assertions of being a very stable genius or the smartest person in the room. Patterns that the audience recognized not because Colbert invented them, but because they had already watched them unfold in real time for years. And the laughter that greeted each intercut clip was therefore the laughter of recognition rather than discovery. A collective acknowledgement that the student Kelly remembered had never been replaced by a more reflective adult, but had instead been amplified by platforms, wealth, and political power. And Colbert refused to let that recognition remain comfortable by pressing the further implication that the Wharton myth's collapse did not merely embarrass one biographical detail, but invited systematic reevaluation of every other pillar that had been constructed with the same materials of absolute confidence and evidentiary thinness. The self-made billionaire story that minimized the scale of inherited capital. The deal-making legend that downplayed the frequency of bankruptcies and bailouts. The branding empire whose valuations often rested more on the projection of success than on the underlying cash flows. And the perpetual insistence that critics were simply too limited to grasp the brilliance on display, each of which suddenly looked less like independent achievements and more like successive applications of the same compensatory logic that had first required the invention of academic supremacy. And the segment's power lay in allowing that logic to become visible through accumulation rather than through accusation, by placing the 1970s professorial recollection beside the 2010s legal testimony beside the 2016 to 2024 rally rhetoric, and letting the formal similarities speak for themselves. A method that stripped the material of easy partisan framing and forced viewers to confront the possibility that the core issue had never been raw intellectual capacity, but the ego structure that treated any gap between self-perception and external evidence as an existential threat requiring aggressive closure, whether through threats to institutions, attacks on the intelligence of opponents, or the endless recycling of the same unamended boasts. And Colbert noted that this structure explained why the story refused to die even after the records and the professor's judgment had entered the public domain, because the myth had never been primarily about persuading outsiders of academic excellence, but about sustaining an internal narrative of superiority that could not tolerate the admission of ordinary limitation, an internal narrative whose political consequences included the inability to concede error, the substitution of volume for precision, and the conversion of every factual challenge into a loyalty test, habits that Kelly had already identified as pedagogical obstacles and that later audiences encountered as governing style. And the longer the segment dwelt on that continuity, the more clearly it revealed that the real subject was not the distant past of one student's transcript, but the present tense relationship between public power and private mythology, a relationship in which the original exaggeration at Wharton functioned as both prototype and justification for later exaggerations whose cumulative effect was to make credibility itself the scarce resource. And Colbert closed the movement by returning to the counterfactual that had haunted the entire piece. If the claim had remained modest, if attendance had been stated without the superstructure of genius and first-in-class status, the absence of honors and the elevated acceptance rates of the era would have been irrelevant biographical footnotes rather than symbols of a deeper fracture. Yet the decision to escalate created a permanent open wound that every new contradiction would reopen, ensuring that the paperwork, once finally examined, would not merely correct a grade point average, but would reframe the entire architecture of self-presentation that had been built upon the original untruth. And in that reframing, the audience was left not with a simple verdict of academic mediocrity, but with a more unsettling recognition that the habits required to sustain the myth, deflection, intimidation, repetition, and the refusal to say "I don't know," had never been confined to the classroom and had instead become the operating system of a public career whose most consistent product was the demand that perception be allowed to overpower reality for as long as the supporting documents could be kept out of reach.